Is the nightmare over? In 8 days' time, by most accounts, Donald Trump will leave the office of the White House and Joe Biden will be sworn in as the 46th president of the United States. But what does it mean for Trumpism? In recent days, we've seen a howl of rage from his supporters storming the Capitol building. We've seen senior Republican allies disown Trump and abandon him. We've seen him banned from Twitter, banned from Facebook and Instagram, and we've seen the Democrats pushing for impeachment. Tonight, on this SWP TV special, we want to go behind the headlines. We want to go behind the sensationalist news stories, and we want to ask the questions that really matter. What lies in store for Trump? What lies in store for his supporters? What lies in store for the movement he's inspired around racism and xenophobia? But also, what lies in store for the left? What will a Biden presidency be like? And how can the left fight back? I'm glad you're joining us, and I'm glad to say that to discuss these questions and more, we're joined by two fantastic guests from the States. I'm delighted to introduce Mike Davis from San Diego in California. Mike is a renowned scholar. He's an author of many books on pandemics, on social histories of the States, and he's written some incredibly useful articles in New Left Review and The Guardian recently to help us navigate recent events. So we're really delighted to be joined by you. Thanks for joining us today, Mike. We're also joined by Virginia Rodino, Virginia's no stranger to SWP TV. She's been on many of these shows before. Virginia is an activist in Baltimore, in Maryland. She's a member of our sister organization, March 21. She's also active in the Green Party and is an anti-racist activist where she is. So a big welcome to you again, Virginia. And of course, the third person or the third member of the panel we're joined by is you at home. I can see there's hundreds of you watching already. Welcome to this SWP TV live broadcast. It's the first time we're live in 2021. I hope you're well, I hope you're safe, and I hope you're ready to fight back. We're live on 4 platforms tonight. If you're watching on Twitter or Facebook or on Instagram, please give this video a like and give it a share so we can reach more people. And if you're watching on YouTube, press that subscribe button so you can find out about future events. And remember, throughout the show, we want to hear your thoughts at home. There's been many events happening in the US over the last few weeks. I'm sure people at home who are watching have comments, have questions, maybe disagreements with what Mike and Virginia are going to say. If that's the case, do post them in the chat and we'll do what we can to read them out. Now, I'm going to dive straight in, and I want to bring Mike in first for the first question of the evening, really. And Mike, I really want to get your thoughts about how we can analyze what happened at the Capitol the other day.
Well, one of the more fantastic moments in the invasion of the Capitol was when the crowd started chanting, "Hang Pence, hang Pence," Mike Pence, Trump's vice president. What happened that Wednesday was nothing less than, I think, the breakup of the Republican Party. On one hand, you have the 140 Republican members of Congress who voted to invalidate the results of the election. This is the hardcore Trump base. This is the bunker, as it were. And public opinion polls since the inauguration of Trump for 4 years and continuing today show that he has unmovable support amongst approximately 40% of registered voters. If you work out kind of back in the envelope calculations on the election results in November, it turns out that out of the 72 million or so votes that he received, the vast majority belong to this group, though there are 17 or 18 million what you might call soft Trump supporters or situational Trump supporters who are not in that hardcore. So Trump is not going away. And particularly in the House of Representatives, Congress people serve for 2 years. So the elections follow very rapidly. And this is where there's the greatest possibility for the Trump camp to continue to take revenge on any defectors and win elections. If you look at the Senate, it's very, very different. And some of the most talented, at least eloquent Republican senators, young Republican senators, people like Tom Cotton of Arkansas, for example, have now defected. And it's in the nature, of course, of the Trump camp that it never forgets or forgives. And the reason for the defection of such a large group, a majority of the Republicans in the Senate denounced the invasion and accused Trump of some degree of responsibility for it. This was not just a reaction to the invasion itself, because for weeks or months since the November election, business has been organizing against Trump. Businesses that historically are the financial infrastructure of the Republican Party. And one of the most amazing things that happened that Wednesday was the organization that you could describe as the historic bedrock of modern republicanism, the National Association of Manufacturers. They actually called for Pence to use the 25th Amendment to depose Trump. So what you see happening here as the Republican Party polarizes into these two camps is that on the Senate side, and senators serve for 6 terms, so they're not easy to remove, and they get tremendous business, corporate contributions, is a kind of realignment of that section of the party with its traditional business base, while the right-wing populist portion will remain with Trump. This is quite astonishing.
It's interesting you say that, Mike, about the schism that's going on in the Republican Party. I guess the question I have on that is, how successful do you think the anti-Trump wing can be in trying to drag the Republicans back to where they were, maybe, but before Trump? Because I saw that poll, I don't know whether you believe it, but the YouGov poll, which said that 45% of Republican voters, I think, supported or agreed with what happened at the Capitol. For the anti-Trump sections of the Republican Party at the top, do you think they can be successful in drawing a line under Trump?
Well, the secessionists, and I must emphasize that we're not talking about so-called the mythical creature, the moderate Republicans. They're not moderate. They remain on the far left. They're I'm sorry, on the far right. They're the post-Trump party, and their greatest strategic asset are suburbs, outer suburbs, wealthy suburbs, the suburbs that have been the holy grail of Obama, Biden campaign, to the neglect of the Democrats' real base. But anyway, this is where they could pose the greatest threat to the Democrats and where they have the greatest purchase, while the hardcore Trump camp will remain strong in rural counties and small towns in cities, or everywhere where evangelical voters constitute a majority. I think you'll see them hanging on to the cult. And of course, the arrests that have occurred and the crackdown by the social media on Trump and so on generates enormous number of grievances and also martyrs for the cause of the, it's essentially a neo-fascist movement now under Trump.
Yeah. On that question, I guess one of the reasons they're abandoning ship is because the scenes from the Capitol last week, were shocking in many ways. And I want to bring Virginia in on this question, which is, some people in the press have talked about this being a fascist coup and so on, which I think is probably a bit wide of the mark. But clearly something quite important happened that day. You had a president at a podium urging, a crowd of people with far-right and fascist elements within it to storm the Capitol. The question I wanted to ask you, Virginia, is do you think those far-right forces, do you think they come out of last week stronger or weakened by what happened at the Capitol?
I think they're definitely emboldened, for sure. So what we're seeing now is Trump and company are calling, and we see mobilization for this for the inauguration this upcoming weekend, that there will be demonstrations by the far right in every state capital and also in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure if they would have had enough of pressure before last Wednesday to be able to call this amount of mobilization, but that's definitely happening. So I do think that it's that they're more emboldened, that they are empowered, and I think that what we saw as well was, if not collusion, certainly light-handedness in terms of the state response and the police response in general to what we saw was the storming of the Capitol. So that is problematic as well, and certainly the light-handedness is not discouraging then to the far right to mobilize additional demonstrations.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, Virginia, and I want to bring Mike in again on this question, which is clearly a lot of people were shocked by the scenes that they saw, and clearly there are far-right elements organizing within it. Do you think, Mike, that the schism you talk about in the Republicans, do you think there is a chance of a break? Could we see some of the more pro-Trump elements at the top of the party, being forced to look at maybe some kind of new formations along the lines we've seen in Europe around, far-right parties like the AfD in Germany and so on? Or do you think that the Republicans can hold together, even going into, the presidential primaries, which will start in 2022 and so on? So what do you think of the prospects of a long-term break within the Republicans?
Well, I believe this is a long-term break, but the structural problem with American politics is that you can have a situation like today where essentially we have four parties, because the Democratic Party is also split and polarized. But forming a third party is so difficult. The obstacles to it are so huge in our system that more than likely the two Republican camps will use the same label, brand themselves as Republicans, but effectively act as two different parties, with the Trumpites being the real spoiler for the 2022 congressional elections, the by-election. If they, as seems likely, go out to wreak revenge on the other Republicans, this could be an enormous opportunity for the Democrats, but we'll see.
Yeah, we've got plenty of questions flooding in from people in the comments watching online. We've got Tara asking, will the US far right have as much confidence without a figurehead in Trump? And we've got Sarah who's asking, what was the American left's response to the Trump supporters storming Congress? And are people responding by organising against these people? I just want to remind people and welcome everyone who's watching at home. We've got around 450 people watching across the 4 platforms already. So please do keep your comments and questions coming. I want to bring back Virginia if I can. If I can bring a Virginia in. It kind of links to what Sarah asked on the Facebook chat, which is obviously lots of people have talked about the discrepancy that, you know, Trump supporters, the response of the police to them, where they're kind of almost allowed to storm the Capitol, with what the Black Lives Matter movement faced over the summer. The question I want to ask to you, Virginia, is, do you think that the political theatre of what happened at the Capitol, does that overstate the threat of the far right in the States? Or, you know, do we see these people being given oxygen by the Trump movement? And how widespread and you know, what kind of threat do you think they represent?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely the Trump administration over the past 4 years gave oxygen to the far right movement. So we understand that these elements existed before Trump. We understand that they've now been given such a wide platform and the oxygen since then. So definitely, you know, there's a major kind of struggle ahead. I mean, going back to what I said in terms of this implicating the state's sort of cooperation or leniency with the far right protesters. I mean, that's a problem in and of itself that we have to address, because what I saw last Wednesday at the Capitol was also, you know, the ruling class's response to the brilliant Movement for Black Lives demonstrations that we have seen earlier, because the ruling classes know that there is a palpable anger among, you know, ordinary Americans around racism, around the inequalities that most of us, you know, face in the class, as well as the awful mishandling of the pandemic. And so, you know, in terms of distracting us and in terms of maintaining, you know, its status quo, I think that is another reason why the state allowed for what happened last Wednesday at the Capitol. So it goes much deeper than Trump. And in terms of, you know, the left's response to this, we are mobilizing, and people are motivated, and we have been seeing a lot of anti-racist, anti-fascist activities going on. So just a couple days ago in New York City, the Proud Boys had announced that they were going to storm through. And for the second time now in the past few months, anti-fascist organizers, including, you know, a broad group of activists like unions and anti-racist and community groups, took to the streets. And it was a few hundred of them, but that sort of response discouraged the Proud Boys and they called off their rally. And this is the type of response we need to do. I mean, we are certainly the many. The anti-fascists are the majority. Even the 70 plus millions of Trump voters, they aren't all Nazis, and we shouldn't just hand them over and relinquish those tens of millions of Americans to Trumpism and to neo-fascism. We can't just discount them. We have to fight to get back the majority of, you know, our fellow workers in our class. And so that is the struggle ahead. And we can win by uniting across, you know, different political lines and so on. And we have to just build a vibrant anti-fascist movement in the United States. Those of us in March 21 have already begun to by joining a group called United Against Hate, which is a coalition that includes that's included participants like NAACP chapters and Islamic and Muslim civil rights organizations, communities of faith and unions, anti-racist groups, and we've come together to discuss how we fight back against this. and what kind of tactics we can use and what kind of demonstrations and mobilizations we're going to be able to plan. And so we've already set our sights to what are we doing for inauguration and MLK Day, which fall in the same time frame. What are we doing around the inauguration? Demonstrations by the left are already being called in DC. And we are already organizing for the World Against Racism Day in March. So just working together in unity, bringing together different groups who normally don't work together, but who are decidedly, firmly anti-racist and anti-fascist. That building has been going on in the States, and that's what we need to see, just a kind of a working class movement that stands up against fascists and makes ourselves more visible than they are. Rather than dismissing them just, as MAGA hat wearers. This is a serious situation that we're in, and so many groups on the left and center left are coming together, acknowledging this and building together.
It's brilliant to hear that, Virginia, and I hope that helps answer some of the questions we've had in the chat about what the left's response is. Please do keep the questions coming. Please keep giving this video a share as well. We're on 580 people watching across all platforms. Help get us up to 600. Do click share and spread the and share the stream. I just want to build on what Virginia was saying. I want to bring Mike back on a point, which is obviously the shocking images which came from the Capitol is, some of the far right people who participated, right? Some of the people wearing slogans on their T-shirts saying Camp Auschwitz and so on. Obviously, we sometimes get an image over here, Mike, that, this is what Trump's base is all like. But the thing we have to realize is that, in November, 71 million people vote for Trump. And I know you wrote something in New Left Review, I think just after the election, trying to really analyze the results. The question I have for you, Mike, is what are the sort of tensions in Trump's base? Because obviously, there's the far right elements who support him. But how is it that in the November election and still he's able to maintain quite a high degree of support amongst his base? Who are these kind of people, do you think?
Well, again, I did a calculation that indicated that about a fifth, or maybe even as high as a quarter of the Trump vote are people who are critical of Trump, but voted for him nonetheless. And of course, we'll know more about this as finally election surveys and subsequent interviews provide more information on people's motives. But the thing that happened in the election was that Biden stupidly abandoned the issue of the economy. The Democrats should have never allowed the pandemic issue to be severed from the issue of jobs. It was the easiest thing in the world to concentrate on we want to bring Americans back to work, and that's why we have to have a national pandemic strategy. They didn't do that. And the result was that Trump, particularly with what seemed to be impressive increase in jobs in October, was able to run as the jobs candidate. Now, the task of beginning to win some of these situational Trump voters back is particularly the responsibility of labor. And one of the things that I found almost shocking about the campaign was the low visibility of the labor movement. There were, of course, some important exceptions. Nurses United, the progressive nurses union, was everywhere. They were the principal union supporting Bernie Sanders. But in many of the old guard unions, particularly industrial unions, leadership seemed too frightened of its own membership to really fight internally to convince people not to vote for Trump, although that was made difficult by the fact that Trump it's still in the minds of so many union members, still seemed to be the one who was fighting to bring jobs back to America, and so on. Now, Biden has announced that he will be the most pro-labor, pro-union president in American history, and progressives in the streets, in the workplace, and in Congress need to hold him to that promise in every way, possible. He's provided an opening here, but so much depends on new organizing campaigns and the reinvigoration of rank and file leadership in the labor movement. The union that had always been the major liberal force, liberal democratic force, the United Auto Workers, is still digging itself out of the rubble of a major episode of corruption amongst its leadership, something that, for instance, helped undermine its attempts to organize auto plants in the American South. But we need to really do everything we can, those of us who are not in the workplace or unionized workplace, to support these struggles.
Clearly, Mike, Biden is going to continue on the vein that you just described during his election campaign. If you look at his response over the last week, he's embracing law and order. He's embracing, disaffected Republicans in the name of bipartisanship and so on. Do you think the Democrats and Biden will benefit from the scare of the Capitol riots? Do you think that by saying that, this is the alternative, you have to get behind us, do you think this will benefit Biden?
Well, again, I mean, the Democratic Party is a two-headed animal right now. And Biden represents an almost exact copy of the last Obama administration. It's a restoration and continuity with progressives and some liberals, now greatly angered by their failure, by his failure to appoint any of the progressive leadership to important posts in the administration. But thankfully, the Democratic successes in Georgia, which above all were due to just a fantastic mobilization of Black voters, the fact that Democrats now narrowly control the Senate absolves progressives of the charge that otherwise Biden supporters might make, because we need unity and we can't do anything too progressive or radical. That excuse doesn't hold right now. But the problem with the progressive side is that the Sanders campaign mobilized this enormous energy to the extent that, in polls, voters under 30, by a considerable majority, said they favored socialism over capitalism. That's an extraordinary moment in American history. But it promised that it would be an in and out campaign, that movements would help progressive candidates win, progressive candidates in turn would help movements grow. And that's not the case. I mean, Bernie Sanders, since his concession in March, has constantly applauded workers' actions and anti-racist actions. He suggests great legislation, as does Elizabeth Warren, but that's always followed by the punchline of send money to this progressive candidate in this state, or sign this petition. And the result was that the far right base of the Republican Party, mobilized by the president, ended up owning protests around the pandemic, despite the fact that Black Lives Matter demonstrations showed that, people on the left, properly masked and so on, posed little little danger of contagion. We should never abandon the streets. And now, more than ever, we need to use streets, workplaces, and community struggles to light a fire under Congress, but more importantly, to sustain activism and to keep pushing to the left, because you're in a period right now where socialist demands for social ownership of the means of production suddenly have real, mass, resonance. Clearly, the nursing home industry has to be broken up, and the private equity firms that largely control it need to be expelled. Amazon and the social media are now the integral infrastructure of this digital age. And we should do as socialists did more than a century ago and demand social ownership under democratic control. You might have said this, 5 years ago or something, and everybody would have yawned. But now it makes sense to millions of people. So within the broader progressive movement, socialists need to advocate, truly radical solutions, or, as Trotsky once called it, transitional demands.
And the same certainly applies here. I wanted to pick up on what you raised about the more sort of progressive or left wing of the Democrats, because obviously they've seen, quite big gains over the last number of years. You talked about Sanders, the Squad, AOC, and so on. How much are they under the discipline of Biden and the right? I noticed he didn't appoint anyone to his cabinet. So how much do you think the left are under that discipline? And with the sort of the left on the ground, do you hear people putting the same kind of arguments that you outlined? The DSA, the growth of socialist groups. Is this something which is being put across regularly, but on the ground? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the problem is that in a period that provides this exceptional opportunity to build a genuinely socialist movement in this country, the left is very fragmented. Its best results and its most effective campaigns have tended to be local, but there is no effective national coalition. I raised this point recently about the failure to mount a national campaign, to create a campaigning coalition in defense of workers in the essential workforce and healthcare workforce. This is what we should have been doing back in April and May, but there is, no group or coalition of groups that's in a position to sell this and support it. So, we see tremendous activities on the local level, particularly in bigger cities. But nationally, the question of how, not just a socialist movement, but for now, a progressive united front could be built. It's unclear how that can be addressed. DSA is highly factionalized and effective on a local level, but nationally, it's not organized to provide any kind of any kind of united response or a consistent program. I hope I'm not offending activists out there, but my impression is the vast majority of people who are active in groups like DSA and so on are well aware of the weakness on a national level. But conditions are so extreme in this country, and I'm not talking just about the deaths. I'm talking, about astonishing high rates of unemployment, the loss of wealth by communities of color, and so on. I mean, it's like in late March, people went to bed. It was 2020. They woke up the next morning. It was 1932, all over again. So the energy, the oxygen, as you will, to combust social struggles will be there, and will grow. But I defer to people like Virginia, who are in the thick of it, for an estimate of what the chances are of beginning to pull together on a national level.
On what you've just said there, Mike, we've got a question from Paul in the chat on Facebook saying that developments in the US are very dangerous. The left need to build the equivalent of an anti-Nazi league. Do the panelists think this will happen? And I'm also going to come to Virginia on a question based on what Ben has written on Facebook, which says the AOC, the Squad, Bernie, etc., are good thought leaders and activists with a broad base, but are they held back by the workings of the Democratic Party? And just to remind everyone watching at home, we've got around 580 people watching so far, so keep your comments coming, press share, click subscribe, click the like button, and so on. I want to come to you on this, Virginia, if that's okay. Partly on what those two comments from the chat raised, and partly what Mike was raising, which is clearly, if you look at Biden's record, you look at how he's responded to, the recent events, to what he was saying during the election and so on, there is a real attempt by the Democrats to write off the Trump years as an aberration, to kind of draw a line under it and restore things the way they were, go back to normal. What do you think are the prospects for this, Virginia? And what do you think we can expect from a Biden presidency? And to add to that, how can the left respond?
Yeah, I mean, I think the focus on electoralism and reformism to make the types of changes that we're talking about that are needed in terms of ridding our country of racism, of fascism, and all of the ills of capitalism. I mean, I think that that we have to certainly look strategically at electoral politics, but we can't rely on it to be the final solution. I mean, the fact that Biden almost lost the election, it was just so painfully, incredibly close against the most unpopular president in history, is quite telling. And he served as vice president under a very, very popular administration. So his policies and his platforms did not resonate, with the majority of people. So I think that that's something we have to remember. I do agree with Mike absolutely about many things, and certainly holding up the importance of rank and file and union movements to help push these changes forward. I mean, it is the heart of the working class that are going to help drive together this progress. So in terms of the progressives in the Democratic Party, yes, I absolutely believe they're held back by the structure of the Democrats, but of electoralism in general. So, I mean, I am active in a progressive political party called the Green Party, but as Mike had mentioned earlier, it is incredibly onerous on any independent third parties to get on the ballot, to raise money, to have any sort of voice. And so so there's that. There's all those obstacles, but at the end of the day, it isn't going to be a political party that brings about these changes either. And so the focus must be on building these united fronts that we've been talking about. And absolutely, not only is it possible in this moment, but it is happening. And so I belong to two different very important, and I'll send out the links to both of these. One is called the Labor labor action to defend democracy, and it came about organized by labor for labor. So these are authentic, unions that are members and participants of this network that came together when it seemed a couple months ago that Trump wasn't going to leave the White House peacefully. So they've been meeting for a few months and talking about what could they do. And these are the unions who passed resolutions to go on general strike if Trump didn't leave peacefully. So these are, rank and file activists that are doing this. And now they are looking, and a number of them have joined another coalition that I'm helping to build called United Against Hate, which is an anti-fascist united front that includes all the groups that I spoke about earlier. And we're working to see how we can connect the two to strengthen each other. And maybe even combine. But the point of the matter is it's not just possible, it's happening. And it's very, very important that it is, because this is the movement that is going to provide, the answers to all of these disenfranchised people, including some of those we see storming the Capitol, because, the discontent caused by the economic crisis is decades and decades in the making. The austerity cuts, the cuts to social spending and social programs that, that the working class desperately needs, and the people who are looking towards some of these neo-fascist ideas are the very people who need government support. And that government support hasn't been happening. And so the enormous amount of real fear and material poverty that a huge swath of Americans, have been facing and are going to, and it's only going to get worse because of the pandemic and the economic fallout because of the pandemic. It's only going to get worse. And it really is unions and organized labor and working class who are going to provide, the solutions. It's not going to be the Democratic Party, unfortunately, because Louis, as you just said, in terms of what we see the Biden administration doing, it's going to be, let's go back to polite status quo, and let's go, let's reach across the aisle, and let's do some bipartisanship. And even if AOC and Ted Cruz sign on and agree to, legislation together, that is not going to bring the changes that we need. And dare I say, even if Bernie Sanders were president, we're going to, enter the White House in a week, we on the left would still need to, hold electeds accountable, because it isn't about reformism that's going to make these changes that we're talking about, that we need to happen. Certainly we want the fringes of society to crawl back under the rocks and the KKK and so on. But we need to provide real answers to the disillusionment of both parties, that Trump helped to stoke and sow the seeds. And so rather than allowing him to have the only answers for these millions of people, we need to go into communities, go into our workplaces, and provide that education and these political arguments about what really, will turn things around for us. And that is, building up worker organizations, that is recognizing what we need to do together in terms of surviving the pandemic together, and pressuring big pharmacy and the government to do the right thing around the vaccines and our health and safety. So I think that, again, these united fronts are existing and are building in the States. And the key is not to dissolve all of our energy into pushing for electoral, victories or electoral reforms, and to instead, just turning around and building up movements in our own communities.
Virginia, it's interesting you say that. You mentioned about the bitterness that led to Trump in the first place. And I want to bring Mike in on this question, which is, we've seen the attacks on working class people from both Republican and Democrat for the last however many years. and you know the bitterness that created that allowed Trump to pose as an outsider in the first place. My question for you, Mike, is how much do you think Biden can deliver on trying to restore the status quo? There's big hopes, isn't there, about him, restoring the centre ground in politics. We've got a similar project here in Britain with what Keir Starmer's trying to do with Labour. When you look at what Biden comes into office against, a raging pandemic where I think it's going to be 400,000 dead by February, economic trouble, obviously the polarization. Do you think, how much can Biden deliver is the question I have for you, Mike.
Well, Biden talks about a second New Deal, but nothing is less likely at this point. I mean, look at the economy. The world radically changed after 2008. And it could not be more clear, I think, at this point, in the United States, that the only source, large-scale source, of decent living wage jobs is going to have to come through the public sector, from public employment. Although public employment's been devastated by the policies of the Trump era. I mean, 1 million workers in federal and state local government have lost their jobs. But in the Depression, you had the most productive economy on earth. The problem was overproduction and finding a way to put workers back to work. And that was ultimately accomplished by the Second World War and then by the linking of productivity increases to wage increases. Nothing like that occurs today. Capitalism is unable globally to create jobs. It's no longer, a job machine. And this is as true in the United States as it is in poorer countries. And I think the left needs to be very clear and explicit about this, because we are on the threshold of seeing tremendous job losses due to the application of artificial intelligence throughout the economy. So none of the conditions or means exist for Biden to unite the country, return us to civility, and at the same time answer the question that he failed to answer during the campaign, like Clinton before him, which is, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, you have to imagine a kitchen table somewhere in Charleston, West Virginia, Youngstown, Camden, New Jersey. And candidate goes to the kitchen table with the family sitting there with their stack of bills. And the one question they would all ask him is, what exactly are you going to do to enhance job security and create new employment opportunities here in Youngstown, in Camden, for that matter, in the Bronx? Democrats have never been able to answer that question, which is why they've lost such a significant sector of unionized workers. So the left has to not only be a source of issue by issue resistance, it has to articulate a realistic vision of what's necessary to provide an answer to the blue collar people sitting around their kitchen table.
Yeah, you talked about the uncertainty of the situation and the volatility, and obviously it looks like that will continue into this year in 2021. And I think in one of your recent pieces, Mike, you kind of wrote that this makes looking in crystal balls a bit redundant, really. But we've had some questions in the chat asking what the potential is for a break from the Democrats? You know, you both have talked about the sort of hold that Democrat politics has had on the left and the Democrat Party. I'm not asking you to predict the future, but what do you think are the prospects for this, and what the left can be doing to agitate for this?
Well, I think the Squad and AOC in particular have in fact acted like Bolsheviks in the Second Duma. That is, they've been tribunes of the people and consistent opposition to the Democratic leadership and the kind of Clinton-Obama restoration under Biden. And much depends on what they're able to accomplish and what they and the movements that support them, the kind of balance sheet they draw up of what's going on inside the Democratic Party. If they, for instance, if AOC got up and said, look, you know, this is a lost cause. These guys are never going to meet the minimal demands of people in New York City or anywhere else. Then I think you have a situation, a conjuncture that might favor the development of a third party. But again, the structural obstacles to this are huge. They're not insuperable by any means. But those of us who believe that the Democratic Party is incapable of carrying out radical reforms and remains more than ever the second party of capital. We have to be careful how we address our own comrades and and supporters, because they're incredibly loyal to the progressives in Congress. But this poses responsibility on those very progressives to continue not only in opposition, but to provide honest estimates of what's going on and the chances for reform. A real blow was in late March when the Biden camp sat down with representatives of the Sanders campaign in subcommittees to talk about issues like green energy, the environment, race, and so on. But in the one on healthcare, the Sanders camp ended up conceding to Biden's fundamentally flawed, deeply flawed proposal for adding a public option to existing Obamacare, but retaining the role of private insurance companies. This, in my mind, was a grave strategic mistake. And Medicare for all, the single-payer national medical system, is, of course, more popular than ever. Every opinion poll shows this, particularly given the fact that so many, millions of Americans, have lost their health insurance during this crisis. And one test of electoral progressivism is how it's able to conduct the fight over this. This should be the absolute non-negotiable demand. And they'll, of course, be accused of treason and, disunifying the Democrats and undermining the 2022 congressional campaign. But that's nonsense. So I think we'll see very quickly in the next year or two, what can be accomplished by the electoral progressives. But without any question, the great emphasis and the highest priority must remain with organizing in communities and workplaces and building large national protest movements.
It's a fascinating insight there, Mike. I'm not sure AOC will thank you for the Bolsheviks comparison, but there you go. I want to come to Virginia on this question as well, because Virginia, as someone who's involved in the organizing on the ground, in anti-racist campaigns, united fronts, and so on, what is the potential amongst not just not just DSA activists and the Democratic Socialists of America, but the sort of, the more fragmented elements of the left outside the Democrats. Is, what are people, what is the talk there about the question of building something outside of the Democrats?
Yeah, so both of the networks that I mentioned earlier, Labor Action to Defend Democracy and United Against Hate, participants who, are broad and diverse. I mean, obviously the labor one is only labor unions, but recognize that a Biden administration is not going to provide the answers, that we, one, not only need to hold it accountable, every step of the way, but also need to fight for alternatives to what's, the Biden administration is posing, and to push it to go even further. So I think that the responses that both networks are getting are incredibly strong, given what's happening in the moment. And so it is adding fuel to our ability to organize and to reach out, and people are, looking for this type of political space to do this work, because we know that we can't do it singularly. Certainly we should be organizing in our own communities at a local level, but in order to link up nationally, and then of course with the World Against Racism Day of Action, to link up internationally. I mean, that is what feeds, our ability to organize, knowing that we're not alone, and then knowing that the answer is to build, as strong of a movement as possible, and as large as one. And luckily, we don't have to look too far back in history, only just a few months ago, to see that it is possible to organize a multi-ethnic, diverse mass movement in the streets, even during a pandemic, that's safe and politically strong, and can move the state to make changes, and to create these types of solutions and these types of answers that we need to hear. So I think that it's happening, and they do exist, and definitely, again, the response has been overwhelming, and people are really interested and organizations are very interested to connect up. So it's been very positive.
It's fascinating to hear an insight from what's going on in the ground, Virginia. So thank you for that. Unfortunately, our hour is almost up. We've just got time for one last question each, really. And I'm going to ask you both, I want to pose the same thing to both of you, starting with Mike, which is, in a word or in a few sentences, what do you think are the prospects and the tasks for the left in 2021? So I'm going to come to you first, Mike, if that's okay.
Well, the United States goes against the global trend. What everybody's focused on right now is the growth and power of the far right. But what's unprecedented in this country, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, has been the development of a constituency for socialism and for people unafraid to use the S word. I mean, we have, enormous tasks ahead of us, but I'm very optimistic, particularly because of the young lions who, you see in the streets and organizing in the campaigns.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. And I'm going to come to you now, Virginia, for the final word about the tasks and prospects for the left.
Yeah, I share Mike's optimism. Absolutely. We can see it on the ground, and then again, just over the past year, we can see brilliant movements, whose shoulders we rest upon. So I think even going back to the students in the States who organize against the school shootings and against gun violence, and then we see the students moving into the climate justice movement and carrying that movement, and then the youth of color who organized the majority of the movement for Black Lives mass demonstrations. So there is a lot of momentum, and there is not a lot of cynicism, in this new generation of activists. about socialism, and there is absolutely critique of if the capitalist system is able to help us create the world that we want. And I think that these movements and the activists within them have said resoundingly no, and we need to create a different world and a better world, and we are doing it. So absolutely optimistic in the days ahead.
Brilliant. Thank you, Virginia. And we share your optimism. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for tonight. Before we go, I just want to leave you with two things. The first is to say that the event tonight was called Dangerous Times. And we do live in some quite dangerous times. And to match these dangerous times, we need dangerous ideas. And we need to arm ourselves with ideas. And part of that is about reading and learning about ideas. And books are weapons to do that. So I want to point people in the direction of Bookmarks Bookshop. Arm yourself with the books of Mike Davis, with anti-racist texts, with socialist texts. And if you are going to do that and get those books, get them from independent socialist bookshops like Bookmarks, not from billion or trillionaires like Jeff Bezos and Amazon. The second thing I just want to say is that if you've enjoyed the discussion tonight, if you agree with what both Mike and Virginia have said about the need for a militant, uncompromising, anti-racist movement, but also for the need for socialists who don't just line up behind the lesser evil, but fight for a better world, a better society, and a better vision of the way things can be, then think about joining the Socialist Workers' Party. We've got activists around the country. We've got a sister group in America, March 21, and we are committed to fighting against racism, but also fighting for that better world. So if you're interested in joining, the details are at the bottom of your screen now. That's all we've got time for. I want to say a big thank you to Mike for joining us from San Diego. Fascinating to listen to you as always. And a big thank you to Virginia joining us from Baltimore. And also a massive thank you to everyone who's watched at home. Nearly 600 of you watching. Please do like, subscribe, follow our social media, and stay in touch and come to future events. And with that, I'm going to leave you and say stay safe, stay socialist, and we hope to see you soon. Thank you.